Okay, so I think that we're live. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on values-based communication. This is the first of 4 sessions, building our understanding of key communication concepts and how to apply these to the LLS audience. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay respects to elders past, present and future. Today we welcome Trudy Ryan from Words for Change. Trudy works to change conversations across climate change, natural resource management, education, advocacy and more. She will be helping us to understand and apply the science of human communication to social and environmental change initiatives. Before we get into the webinar, let me introduce myself and run through some quick housekeeping. I'm Jackie Gregg, Communications Officer for the Central West, and I will be your facilitator today. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat function which allows you to actively participate in today's webinar. We encourage you to type your questions and comments here. All participants are muted and this webinar will be recorded today. So let's get started on changing the conversation. Over to you, Trudy.
Thanks very much, Jackie, and good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome on a cold morning here in Northeast Victoria, where I'm coming from, at least today. I'd like to say thank you to Jackie for her assistance in organising these webinars. Just a bit of background about myself for context. I've worked in environmental research, education, communication for about 30 years now, and I'm an ecologist by training and also by passion. And I've worked in all sorts of NRM related jobs over the years, so on ground with Landcare, doing research with CSIRO, teaching at unis, National Park Ranger, so a whole range of different NRM based positions. But for the last decade or so, I've been really focused on NRM communication and environmental communication more broadly. In fact, I've become pretty much obsessed by the challenge of environmental communication and how we can get people engaged and interested and how we can cut through on our issues amongst all the noise and distraction out there, and to really connect with people and drive positive environmental change. So this has led me to look at other fields outside of NRM, outside of ecology, outside of traditional communication even, things like psychology, behavioural science, neurobiology, cognition, linguistics, marketing and even political campaigning, to better understand how do people reason about the information that they're given, how do they come to judgments on information, what shapes their perceptions, and how can we apply these learnings in our very broad field of NRM to foster positive behaviour change. So today and over the next sessions, I'd like to share some of these learnings with you, and I hope you'll find them helpful as you go about your work in planning and delivering communications with your different audiences. So we've got 4 sessions over 4 weeks in which to go through this approach to values-based messaging. Today, you can see I've highlighted in orange, we're starting with facts and frames. Next week, we'll take a deep look at the psychology of human values motivation and look at how words can encode and activate values that shape mindsets and perceptions. In week 3, we'll hop up and look in more detail at language choice in a session called Words for Change, and we'll be looking at things like metaphors and how just some little tips and techniques and tweaks that we can apply to our language can really strengthen our messages and help us to connect and engage with our audiences. In week 4, we'll bring all our learning from session 1, 2 and 3 together, and we'll go through a worked example so that you can see how you go through the process of actually creating a values-based message that's relevant to your audience. If you miss a session, we're doing a repeat of the Wednesday sessions on Friday, so you can catch up then. And before we start too, I really want to stress I intend for these sessions to be very practical and very helpful so that you've got lots of strategies to apply next time you sit down to plan your comms, you know, be it a newsletter article, a talk for a school group, a talk at a field day, a presentation to your board, a funding application, whatever it is you find yourself doing. We're always communicating, even if our job doesn't have communications in the title. So I want these sessions to be very practical and helpful to you. So if you have any questions, please Pop them in the chat box. We'll have time for questions at the end of each session, and you're always welcome to email me between sessions as well if something comes to mind. So what is values-based communication or messaging, and how can it help you as you go about communicating with your different audiences and trying to activate positive behaviour change? So values-based messaging aims to change hearts, minds and actions in that order, as we will discuss in some detail over the coming sessions. It brings together an understanding of human values, motivation and message framing. It's evidence-based and it draws on research from a whole range of fields, such as the ones I mentioned before: behavioural science, psychology, sociology and more. And what we're doing is engaging people on shared values, very much based on an understanding of human values, motivation and values activation that we'll really hone in on next week. And in values-based messaging, we stick to the truth. So this is not the Donald Trump school of spin or anything like that. We're sticking to the truth. So values-based messaging is about presenting evidence, data, information, facts within a values-based frame so that the truth can be heard, understood and acted on. Today specifically, we'll start with the cold hard facts on facts, and we'll run through some reasons why facts on their own just aren't enough to persuade people and drive behaviour change. We'll look at and define and explain the concepts of frames and framing and run through some examples of climate change framing that you might have familiarity with, to demonstrate how framing effects work and how they can influence reasoning, as also we'll go into, you know, how you go about reframing a message and what you don't do as well, which is an important thing to keep in mind too. We'll conclude our session today by looking at 3 powerful and really empowering frames for us in our very broad field of NRM that are useful for you to keep in mind when you're preparing your own communications. So let's make a start. So if, like me, you have a science background, and many of you will, then you might have been taught that reason is rational, that when presented with evidence, people will come to factual, logical, unemotional and universally consistent judgments about that information. And therefore, all we have to do is provide people with lots of information, and then they'll read that information and they'll be so compelled to act on whatever it is: weed invasion, soil erosion, feral animals, whatever issue you're trying to convey, is that if we can only tell people what the thing is, that they'll be moved to act. You know, it's the classic sort of, if only people knew, we've got to tell them, we've got to put it in a newsletter, we've got to do this. But thinking that we can change people's minds and urge them to act by confronting them with just more and more information is flawed, because our brains just don't work that way. And that's because, sadly, the facts are not at all persuasive, particularly on their own. So if facts were persuasive, the graph on the right, the percentage of American people saying that climate change is real and human caused, would be the same as the one on the left. So here the scientists are saying, yes, climate change is happening and human caused. And over here, the people, and unfortunately in the American public, most people are saying, nah, I don't reckon, or I don't know. So this is this example of climate change we're familiar with, but I'm sure you can think of lots and lots of examples from your own work where the facts on their own just haven't been enough to convince people. So why is it? Why is it that our facts aren't enough to connect and engage with people and convince them to change? Why aren't our evidence-based messages getting through? As communicators, and we're all communicators, we need to come to terms with this. Is that people seek information that confirms, not confronts, their worldviews, their values and their identity. And it's very hard to displace a feeling with a fact. And we're seeing this in all sorts of things in the world at the moment. And this is a hugely reinforcing neurobiological process, because seeing or hearing information that we agree with actually triggers the release of dopamine, the reward hormone. And this sort of spins us into a positive feedback loop in which we tend to seek out information we agree with, so we get another dopamine hit, and so on it goes. So it's physiological, it's biological, it's psychological, and these days, of course, it's very accelerated by social media. So, for example, we all know that Facebook algorithms work to tap into our tendency to seek affirmation over information, because you're only kind of ever really shown things that you agree with and that just reaffirm and consolidate your worldview. We've also got a problem in that, as people who care very much about the environment, and in our work, we've got this front row seat on things like species decline and weed invasion, impacts of drought and natural disasters. And to try and sort of cut through and implore people to listen about these issues, we often start our communications with problems. It's like we want to get a megaphone and say, you know, you won't believe what's happening now. You've got to listen to this. And we start with problems. And you know the sort of the headings that I'm talking about. Things like, you know, pollination crisis looms as bee populations crash, and Western Sydney will be uninhabitable due to climate change. You know, big headings. We tend to start with problems. But the problem with problems is that people already have enough of them, and so they switch off, they turn away, they disengage. And this doesn't mean that we should shy away from the facts and the problems. They're a really super important part of our message. But what it means is that we just don't lead our messages with problems, as we'll go into some detail. The way we structure the information in our messages is really very important for people's comprehension. And of course, there's a lot of noise out there as well. And people have never been so distracted by so many different types of distractions. If you've got teenagers, you'll know what I mean as well. Constantly wired in, constantly with a screen. So we're bombarded with thousands upon thousands of messages every day. And in that, your facts have to be very special to break through and capture people's attention. So if facts aren't framed or presented in a way that allows the truth to be heard and understood, then the facts will just bounce off frames. You'll only see it when you believe it. And if you don't believe it, you just won't see it. So, for example, research shows if you don't believe in climate change, you're much less likely to attribute an extreme weather event like a cyclone to climate disruption than someone who does, who will. So there's some really interesting biases and things going on in our minds. But what does this all mean for NRM? It means that we need to apply the science of communication to communication, just as we always apply the science of soil science to our soil science work, the science of agricultural science in our work, the science of environmental science. We must also apply the science of human communication to our communications. Otherwise, we risk our time, effort, resources, and our precious few opportunities to connect and drive change. So in NRM, in land care, in sustainable ag, in conservation, throughout the whole environmental sector, we know our communication resources are always limited and they're always stretched. So we can't afford to do comms just for comms' sake. We've got to be strategic. And that strategy starts with an understanding of how people really reason about information and what shapes their perceptions and what will move them to see our information in a new light and engage them in positive behaviour change. So cognitive science, that's the science of the mind and the brain and how we process and integrate information, demonstrates now through some really intense work done over the last few decades that people reason or think about information in terms of frames and values and metaphors and imagery, not just facts and data alone. And we're going to talk about each of these elements in detail over the next few sessions. But for today, as I said, we're going to focus on frames and framings and talk about how an understanding of these can help us in our broad field of NRM. So, frames are evoked by words. So when we hear a word, it activates mental associations that we've tied to that word. Our experience, our values, our emotions, So say, for example, if I say the word nurse to you, the mental associations or the neural circuits and connections that fire up in your brain might include things like hospitals and doctors and bandages and injections and drips. It'll bring up the sight and smell of hospital food, perhaps. Also, the emotions associated with your experiences with a nurse. So perhaps kindness and care, perhaps uncertainty and fear if it was a bad situation, and so on. So when we think of the word nurse, for example, the frame of understanding or mental model, the mental files that we're pulling in our brain, it's so much more than just the dictionary definition. It's bringing a whole frame of association to mind. So frames are mental structures that shape the way we see the world, and they're physical because they're inside our heads. They're not ideas floating around space. They're actually the neural circuits in our brain. So they're built up over a lifetime of experience. They're tied to emotion. They're embodied. They're within us. And these frames, they're very helpful because we're bombarded with so much information all the time. It's like taking a sip from a fire hose. So these frames act as these cognitive shortcuts through which we can filter and process information, perhaps reject information if it's not relevant to us. And this mostly goes on beneath the level of our conscious awareness, in less than 1/10 of a second. There's a saying in neuroscience that says the neurons that fire together wire together. And what this means is the more these frames in your mind are activated, they become strengthened with that repetition. The more you say something, the more you hear something, the stronger that connection gets in your brain, the more durable it becomes and the more automatic it becomes over time. So, for example, Donald Trump is a master of this, and he keeps saying the same things over and over again, such as things like, the election was stolen. And the more people hear that in their heads, the more they're exposed to that, the stronger that neural circuit becomes, the more automatic that way of thinking. And so that can go on to shape perceptions very strongly. So frames shape how you think and how you reason. Our frames define our individual idea of common sense because it just becomes an automatic way of reasoning. So this is how two people can interpret the same information or experience completely differently. They're filtering information through different frames or worldviews. So there's the frames in our head, and there's framing, which is the way information is presented deliberately or otherwise to us. So framing activates the deep frames inside of us. So COVID-19 lockdowns, such as we're experiencing here again in Victoria, activate a fear and scarcity frame in some people, which leads them to panic buy toilet paper. Framing can hide or highlight information. So just as in this drawing, we can see the fish. You can see the torchlight is shone upon the fish, and that's where our attention is drawn. But we can see that there are other things in that picture that are hidden or haven't been drawn to our attention. So in this way, same way, framing can hide or highlight information depending on where our attention is drawn. So think, for example, about how our collective passage out of these COVID times has been variously framed to us by politicians and social commentators and others. You'll be familiar with terms like snapback, which I think was our Prime Minister. It's a journey, a reimagining. For some people, it's a time of anxiety and uncertainty. For others are seeing it as an opportunity. I've even heard it described as being a portal to a different future, which is kind of nice as well. So many more, and you will have heard more of them. All of these different framings of passage out of COVID fire up different neural circuitry in our brain and draw to mind different emotions and understandings and associations. And in that offers us different reasoning outcomes. So such frames hide and highlight options. In this sense, framing can narrow or widen our options in thought. It opens or constrains our creativity, depending on where we're shining that light in the pond. So through our framing of issues and information that we want to convey to others, we can literally choose to shine a light on different parts of the pond. And if we extend that metaphor, we can use a wide beam, a narrow beam, a soft focus, low beam, etc. So ultimately, framing shapes how we think about something. And this mostly happens, as I said earlier, beneath the level of our conscious thoughts and awareness. So we're just guided into a way of thinking by the words that are presented to us. Framing is everywhere. You can't escape it. All words evoke frames, whether you intend them to or not. So that's just something to ponder during the week. Try and be really mindful for framing effects as you read the news or, watch the telly. What frames are in our heads? Think about that. What frames are in the heads of others? How did they get there? And consider some of those framing effects. Do they narrow or widen our thinking? Are they hiding or highlighting different points of view? And there's a lot of rich framing stuff going on at the moment around the COVID stuff in Victoria. Is a really good place to look and see what sort of frames are people putting into mind. For example, some people are stressing the economic impact, some people are more focused on public health. They're different framings, they're different points of view that are being weighed up. I wanted to run through a classic example of framing that's been well discussed in the environmental communication literature. It's one that's close to our hearts here in natural resource management and conservation more broadly, just to show you how it's done. So this man here is Frank Luntz, and he was the communications consultant to George W. Bush during that presidency. He's a master framer, and he has twisted, I think it's fair to say, social reasoning on all sorts of things for political advantage. So, for example, he reframed undocumented immigrants into illegal aliens, and things like drilling for oil into exploring for energy, which sounds less sort of dramatic. And he also turned the estate tax into a death tax. So, he's very good at reframing for political gain. And he also he has been attributed with turning global warming into climate change in the early 2000s. So I wanted to show you some text, and this is from this sort of infamous climate change memo that you can Google, where he advises George W. Bush's administration, it's time for us to stop talking about climate change instead of global warming, to start talking about climate change instead of global warming. Climate change is less frightening than global warming, while global warming has catastrophic connotations attached to it. Climate change suggests a more controllable and less emotional challenge. So this reframe, and it worked. You can see how the terms, the prevalence of the use of the terms changed over time. It took people and human agency out of climate change, and we've struggled to connect the two since. So the idea was that climate sort of had this nice connotation and might get you thinking about holidays and far off places and palm trees and so on. And change in and of itself just leaves out human agency and causation. The climate just changed. And with this frame, no one's to blame. And by extension, if no one's to blame, no one has to or even can do anything about it, because change just is. Continuing the climate framing theme, here's another example of climate framing in action. And I stress here, I'm not pushing any particular political barrow. There's, of course, lots of great examples of framing on all sides of politics. I'm just using this example from the public record because it's one we're mostly familiar with. And it's also a really great example of framing in action. So you'll remember back in 2011 when the Gillard government introduced a carbon pricing scheme, the Tony Abbott-led opposition went in really hard using repetition to reframe that carbon price as a carbon tax. So when we're thinking about frames, it's good to just take a step back and reflect and think, what's in that frame? What's in that frame? What are those words evoking? As I said earlier, what mental associations are coming to mind? What emotions are you drawing on? What mental files are you pulling up? What neural circuits are connecting? So think about the words pricing scheme. What frame does that draw? I'm not an economist, but for me, I would think, oh, that's about sort of incentives and, policy instruments and, user pays and trade-offs. That would be the frame that would come to mind. You understand it's some sort of economic policy instrument. But when we're talking about tax, what's in a tax frame? How do we all feel about tax? You know, it's like a dirty three-letter word. That's how it's been promoted. That's the dominant frame that's been constructed around tax. It's talked about as, it's framed as a burden that we need to have relief from. It's you taking it off me, that kind of thing. And it's very effective, and it causes a lot of fear. And you'll know that it's used exhaustively around, campaigns and political election times. We hear the word tax, tax, tax. So knowing this, as politicians do, the opposition reframed the carbon pricing scheme as the carbon tax. And we heard carbon tax over and over again. So remember, activating and strengthening those neural pathways until even Labor started using the opposition's term, effectively doing their messaging for them. And it will forevermore be the carbon tax. That's just what we all got used to, that reframe. And the campaign went on and on, of course, until the legislation was eventually repealed. Now, just as a little end note to this framing example, and you might have missed this, but a few years ago in 2017, Peter Credlin, who was former Prime Minister Tony Abbott's Chief of Staff, she explained on her Sky News show that the carbon tax was actually never a carbon tax. And she said, along comes a carbon tax. It wasn't a carbon tax, as you know, but we made it a carbon tax. We made it a fight about the hip pocket and not about the environment. So this reframe shifted hearts and minds and actions and policies and outcomes, and we're still messing around as a nation trying to find a way forward on this issue. So framing is more than just a matter of words. These words can shape our worlds. So that's just an example, using some climate change examples to show you how these framing effects can really shape and influence our perception and our reasoning. So let's have a go now at applying framing in practice, just so you can see and also feel, because this is a lot about how we're feeling in values-based messages. We're really tapping into emotion. So here's two words that describe roughly the same thing: environmental protections, environmental regulations, that sometimes might even be used interchangeably in the same article, for example. So let's just consider the term environmental regulation. So as I said, think what's in a frame, what comes up for you, what associations, what emotions, what connections, experiences. How does that term make you feel? Regulations. So on my screen, I can't see the chat box at the moment. Perhaps if you could just don't overthink it, but type in a word or two. What emotions does regulations bring up for you? And perhaps, Jackie, if you wouldn't mind reading some of those out to me, because
not a problem. We haven't had any come through yet, but I'm sure everyone is very busy typing.
Good. So yeah, don't overthink it, because these framing effects tend to operate below the level of our conscious thought. So just go with your gut reaction on it. You'll see I've done a bit of preemptive framing there with some colours, just to show you how easy it is to influence perception. Anything coming up?
Not yet.
Yeah, okay.
I'm going to jump in and say that, especially with the orange and the green that you've used, the protections feels like a good thing. We're protecting something, and regulations feels bad.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So and I'm assuming people.
Here we go. So Jane Crystal, she said regulations is limiting.
Limiting.
Mel Schrader, regulations, rules and restrictions. Michelle Dawson, rules and constriction.
Yep.
Control from Edmund. Kirby saying protecting the environment. Yep. Mel Schrader's come back with protections, improvements for the betterment of the environment.
Yep. Sure. What else do people think of when what frame comes to mind with protections?
Kevin is saying regulation sounds like Big Brother.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about we just tune in on protections for a bit? What's coming up?
Penny is saying that regulations look like stop.
Yeah. Right.
Jane Phillips, one is incentive and one is forced.
Right. Yes.
Jan, regulations means rules, protections are worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Maddie, regulations, authoritative, protections are friendly. Jane Crystal is saying protection is safe.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, so you can see that. Thank you, everyone. They're great. And what I'm going to do is I'll get a copy of those off you, Jackie, and we'll revisit those words that you've brought up. We'll revisit those next week when we look in detail at how the words that we use actually encode values that trigger or flip us into a way of thinking. So thank you. That's really helpful. So you can see here there's two words that roughly describe the same thing, but evoke very different frames, very different reasoning outcomes. You know, one's basically because you have to, and one's because you want to. So the thing about framing is that we're capable of seeing the world through multiple frames or viewpoints, but not at the exact same time. So can you have a look at the photo of this man? Can you see his side profile? And can you see his front profile, his front face profile? You can see both of them, but not at the exact same time. And believe me, I have tried and you can't. You can see one, you can see the other, but not at the same time. And in the same way, we can never activate alternate frames simultaneously in our mind because of the process of something called mutual inhibition. So what happens when one frame or neural circuit in our head is activated, one frame of reasoning, the activation of alternative frames or neural circuits is momentarily blocked, which is why multitasking is a myth. That's why, you know, you will spill your coffee on yourself if you're trying to also drive. When appropriate, in some contexts, we can present many environmental regulations, many actions as protections or regulations with very different reasoning outcomes, for example. So, you know, the right thing to do with a broader chance of education and engagement or just as compliance. And there's a big psychological difference between doing something because it's the right thing to do and doing something because it's something that you have to do. So given this is how our brain works, that we can see that point of view, we can also see that point of view, but not at the same time. The challenge for us as NRM communicators is to toggle people into the best frame of thinking through our messaging, and it might be about protections, for example, and to hold them there, and then to activate and strengthen that neural pathway through repetition in our communications. So that frame just becomes common sense. That's the way we view the world. And in our case, we can do that by using values-based frames in our communications that activate a sense of environmental stewardship, connection, compassion, responsibility, helpfulness, and so on. And how we do that by engaging in activating particular values is what we'll discuss in great detail next week. So let's move into reframing, or how you might respond to a message frame that you oppose. So continue our climate change example. Do you remember when Tony Abbott, our former Prime Minister, famously told farmers that climate change is crap? And so how do you respond to that? How do you respond to that? The automatic response is that you want to refute, probably fairly crossly, that climate change is not crap. And we see this refutation in advocacy messaging all the time. Lots of don'ts, stops, wants, nots. But when you do that, you're actually just reinforcing the frames or circuitry around that opposing argument. Because research shows that we tend to, over time, we remember the assertion, the thing that was said, and we forget the negation, the nots, the don'ts, the stops. So watch carefully on the screen when I remove the negation from this argument. You've just got your original message. Because negating a frame Saying no to it, saying don't, saying stop, just activates a frame. And why is this? It's because you actually have to think about something in order not to think about it. So, for example, if I say to you, don't think of an elephant, don't think of an elephant, what comes to mind? What neural circuitry is activated in your brain? What frame of reference are you dragging up? So if I say to you, don't think of an elephant, don't think about them with their big floppy ears, their long trunk, their big tusks, don't think of an elephant. What are you thinking of? Of course, you're thinking of an elephant. So reframing requires a rewiring of the brain, even momentarily. A change in understanding occurs through the activation and strengthening of a different frame. So remember that idea of mutual inhibition. We want to toggle and hold people in the best frame of reasoning for our line of work. So the key to reframing is to put your message in a new frame. And you can do this sort of literally and metaphorically. So this means when you do this is that you're telling your story, not just refuting someone else's. So this avoids negation and activating and strengthening an opposing view, which is what we don't want to do. Of course, we stick to the facts and we speak that truth with moral conviction, which effectively captures the high ground and is very hard to argue against, as we'll talk about next week in our values session. So whether you're reframing or even if you're starting with coming up with a fresh frame, the logic is the same. You know, own your frame, think of it in that way, tell your story. Here's an example from before. How would you reframe this climate change is crap statement? Instead of saying climate change is not crap, a simple reframe might be something like, humans are disrupting global climate patterns through overuse of fossil fuels. You're capturing the frame, you're just saying it how it is. Keep this in mind, positive persistence beats negative resistance. This is from Professor George Lakoff, who pioneered much of the work on framing and negation that I've talked about today, and he's from the Uni of California in Berkeley. George Lakoff always stresses, tell people what you want them to think or do, not what you don't want them to think or do, because of that idea of activation and strengthening. So I'm learning, and it's a work in process, but I've learned to say to my 10-year-old, please remember to bring your lunchbox home from school, instead of don't forget to bring your lunchbox home from school. But we're still working on it. So you can think of frames as guides that help people interpret what they see or hear. So as communicators, our framing choices have the power to influence people's understanding of the issues that we care deeply about, and to shape the public response and even the policy response to issue, as we've seen with the climate change examples discussed earlier. So to finish off our session today, I wanted to run through 3 powerful and empowering frames for change that I think are critical for our broad field of NRM and environmental communications. So these are handy things to keep in the back of your mind, and you might jot them down when you're sitting down to develop your messages and thinking about how you want people to respond to the information that you're presenting. Because primarily in our broad field of NRM, you're wanting to educate and engage and inspire and get people on board with the great work you're doing and encourage that positive behaviour change and that sense of environmental stewardship. First up, the first frame emphasises hope over fear. So how can we do that with words? We say what we're for and not what we're against. So rather than people need to have a vision or an aspiration to ignite their imagination and sense of purpose and trajectory. So lots of people have pointed out, and it's true, that Martin Luther King had a dream, not a complaint. Not a plan. He got people on board with the dream. People need something to work towards, not just against. So, for example, we're for healthy soil ecosystems, not against soil degradation. It's just more empowering. You can feel that flip. So, of course, in this, we need to be real. We need our facts. We need our evidence. And we need to acknowledge the urgency of the challenges we face. So I'm not talking about mindless optimism or what some people call bright siding, which is a nice term. Because we know that rings false. So I'm talking about evoking a mindset in people that imagines there's a possibility to work towards. So one strategy we can use to do this is to be very solutions focused in our work and to outnumber our problems with solutions by focusing also on the benefits of doing something over the risk of not doing something. They're just little logic flips, but they're very powerful. This demonstrates to people that there are pathways and there are options available. And I think this is even more important all the time, as most of us are working in regional communities that are stressed, that are even traumatised with ongoing waves and shocks and things like cyclones and bushfires and droughts and floods. Everything unprecedented, of course, coming at us, global market shifts, industry transformation, COVID-19. You know, we know that there's growing rates of anxiety and depression in our communities. We have to be mindful of this in our messaging and look for a way to build agency and purpose and hope into our messages so that we can give people pathways and options and a sense of traction and momentum out of these problems. The second frame for change is I call here, now, together. So we have this real human tendency or bias perhaps to avoid things that are unpleasant, uncertain or off in the distance, and psychologists, they call this psychological distance. So we need to try and reduce this psychological distance and bring our environmental issues psychologically closer for people in space, so geographically, and in time as well, so they're more real and familiar and current. So, for example, and it is shifting a bit, but climate change is the classic sort of thing that has psychological distance, because we often regard it as something that will happen somewhere else, sometime in the future, to someone else. So this idea of there, then, and them. It's polar bears, melting ice caps, they're kind of the iconic images or frames of reference for climate change globally, which is kind of the ultimate psychological distance and very different to the climate change impacts that we're experiencing on the ground where we live. So think about how you can create stepping stones, as you see in the picture, stepping stones in your messaging to reduce this psychological distance and bring it back to this idea of here, now, together. Because if we don't do this in our messaging, we risk sort of invoking the classic bystander effect. It's like, you know, someone else will take care of it. I don't need to do anything about it, not now at least. So we need to reduce that idea of psychological distance. One strategy we can use to do this is to really foreground people and place in our stories and keep our references really familiar and place-based and community-based so that people can recognise themselves or their landscape or, you know, their industry in your scenario or your story or your article. You know, so people have this sense of connection that, oh, that's my landscape you're talking about, that's my community, and so on. So real people, real stories, and taking a really clear and current tone of action to sort of, you know, reduce that psychological distance and bring our actions into the present, not just something we might do in the future. Because it's important for us to keep in mind, as people working in natural resource management, you know, you're probably all really excellent future thinkers, but most people aren't. And there was a really interesting study done by the University of Tennessee in the US on people's perception of the future, and they found that most people can't even imagine a future beyond 15 years. And they say the future goes dark at 20 years for people. They can't imagine landscapes, they can't imagine society, they can't imagine governance. So it's really interesting, this idea of putting things too far out in the future. It's unimaginable for people. So we need to build these little stepping stones into our language to take people from what we're doing today to what those outcomes will be in the future. So we take people forward with us through our explanation. Just like you're good future thinkers, I'm sure you're all good systems thinkers as well by training and practice and experience. But again, most people aren't. So when we're drawing attention to cross-scale linkages and interactions, we're doing a public service because we're filling a real vital knowledge gap in society, and that is building and understanding people's understanding about systems. So if we can build people's understandings about systems and interactions and interdependencies, that kind of thing, we're actually helping ourselves out because we're giving people a frame of reference, some mental files to draw on, through which they can understand natural resource management more generally, so they'll understand and by extension support what it is we're trying to achieve in NRM. So we need to make links, lots of links in our communications to build this systems understanding, to engage and educate people about systems wherever we can. So we can do this by crossing scales, crossing sectors, drawing in co-benefits, linking NRM and agriculture, environmental management beyond those typical sectors, linking them to health, education, recreation, connection, livable communities, all that sort of thing, linking rural and regional to towns and cities and so on, making as many links, embedding and enmeshing NRM across these different systems and scales. Because the only way we can ever really achieve meaningful systems change is through collective action. So another thing we can do is to build this momentum and establish these social norms around environmental stewardship by telling stories that link individual actions or projects that you might be undertaking. When you're writing about these, when you're talking about these, lift people's gaze up to the next scale and talk about the stories that people are doing in other catchments, in other regions, across the state, throughout Australia, and so on. And so demonstrates this idea of this is just what we do. It's a common sense frame. So we're demonstrating social proof and social norms, and doing that is very powerful and empowering in fostering positive behaviour change. I'll leave it there today, so we've got some time for questions, but thank you for your time and attention today, and I hope you found that helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trudy. I'm just popping, your face is now live so everyone can see you. I don't know that everyone could see you before. I think they could just see the slides. So you might want to give everyone a little wave and we'll just see if any questions are coming through. I think there is a little bit of a delay of the questions coming through also. That happened before. So we'll just wait a couple of seconds. Maybe Trudy, did you want to reiterate your email address and your website that people can contact you on?
Yeah, sure. So it's just trudy.ryan, that's Trudy with an I, at wordsforchange, or one word, .com.au.
And maybe while we're waiting to see if any comments come through, did you want to just give us a little bit of a brief outline of what we'll be expecting next week? So next Wednesday's session will be running at the same time, 10 to 11. Did you want to let us know what we can be expecting?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jackie. Next week, we're going to be talking about the science and the psychology of human values motivation, which is an enormous field in itself that has great relevance to us in environmental and NRM communication. So understanding how the words we use encode different values that activate different frames of reasoning for people, and that's where we're getting into values-based frames. So it's really interesting, and it's relevant beyond, to your life beyond NRM as well. So I hope you'll come along and enjoy that session and find it helpful.
Excellent. Well, I think that might wrap us up for today. We've had a thank you comment, so comments are coming through, and I don't think we have any questions. You were obviously far too comprehensive and clear, and we know exactly what we're doing.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I do appreciate you coming along, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for your time today.